Hello, everyone, and welcome to Diversity Matters, where we explore all things diversity, equity, and inclusion related. I'm your host, Oscar Holmes IV, and I'm so delighted to welcome Julie Kratz to the guest chair today as we talk about effective allyship. Julie Kratz has dedicated her career to helping people be better allies. After spending 12 years in corporate America, she founded her own speaking business and has worked with many organizational leaders to foster more inclusive environments. She is a Forbes contributor, co-host of the Inclusion School podcast, and a TEDx speaker. She holds an MBA from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, is a certified master coach, and a certified unconscious bias trainer. Her work has appeared in many media outlets, and she is the author of 6 books. Julie Kratz, welcome to Diversity Matters.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
We'll be back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Looking for an affordable and efficient way to create your next podcast, live stream, or promotional video? Introducing the Studio at Kearney Point. Catering to creators, marketers, corporate, and educational brands alike, our state-of-the-art studio provides the flexibility you need to produce the creative content your audience is looking for. Our friendly and knowledgeable staff will handle the technical details, keeping you free to focus on what matters most, creating the best possible media for your audience. Click the banner now for a free consultation.
So Julie and I met about a year ago as we were both speakers at this corporate DEIB event. I had the misfortune of speaking directly after her, but I'm glad that I arrived early enough to catch a large portion of your session, Julie, because I learned so much from you, and I can't wait for my listeners to learn as much from you on this podcast as I learned from you at that event. So Julie, let's get started. You had a very successful career in corporate America and then transitioned to founding your own DEI consulting business. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and what factors influenced you to make that career switch?
Yeah, I think for me, there were a lot of pivot points along the career. And as many people experience, you try to find your home. You try to find where you belong, where you matter. And as a white woman, even, it just was very difficult to try to nest into these very male-dominated spaces. And I kept trying to reinvent myself and do all the things that corporate wanted you to do. And it just felt less and less meaningful. Especially when I had my daughter. I remember going to work and looking at her and thinking, this is kind of silly, right? Like, there's so much more meaning to life. I also happened to stumble upon a lot of people at the time that were expressing very similar sentiments that the world is becoming more diverse and we need more allies. And maybe it's not us that need to be fixed. Maybe we need the systems to be fixed. So kind of put the puzzle pieces together and had the gumption to start my own business. But I have to be honest, it was really risky and it felt really scary at the time. And now looking back almost 10 years later, I'm really thankful I made that leap, but it's hard. The safety net of a corporate career, paychecks are really lovely. Benefit packages are really lovely. But at the end of the day, I think everyone has to find out what's meaningful for them, what gives you purpose, what fuels you, where your gifts are. And I'm just thankful I get to do this work that matters because, as your podcast says, diversity matters.
Yes. And we are really thankful. Again, like I said, I had the opportunity to watch you in action, actually learn a lot from the great wisdom and experiences that you shared with the corporate attendees at that event. And the work that we do is impactful. When you think about working in a company and all the great things you can do in one company, but one of the things that I realize is it's like how your impact can really spread if you're working with many different companies. And so we definitely appreciate that you made that switch because you're doing such impactful work. I imagine the 6 books that you wrote occurred after your corporate career ended and you pivoted into your own business. And so is that correct?
Yeah, I have no shortage of ideas. I think that's one of my issues. And also, having seen you in action speaking, you have no shortage of ideas as well. I love my favorite part of the writing process is getting to talk to people that are in the spaces doing the work and sharing ideas and garnering kind of key themes or recipes that other people can follow, because I think that's what people are looking for right now with diversity work. They want a formula to follow, which is interesting because you and I know there's really no formula to follow, but people want that playbook. They want to know, okay, if I do step one and step two. And so, well, I know it's not that simple, giving people specific ideas, ways that they can take action, talk tracks, scenarios, questions to ask. It's something I love to write about. And so I'm always listening. When I do get to speak with groups, especially corporate groups, my favorite part is the questions people ask, because they just ask like the wildest things. And I'm always so curious about that. Like, there's so much curiosity in those questions that you can apply to, I'll write an article, or, sometimes people do inspire me to write books or other pieces about it. But one of the questions I got recently, someone asked, well, what do I do if my manager is not inclusive? And, it was a really good idea for my Forbes column. And so it inspired, hopefully, other people can learn from that question as well.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So I want to ask you if there's a specific experience or question that you could think of that inspired, going to focus on today, allyship and action. Was that spawned from a corporate engagement where someone asked an interesting question, or was that just already in the queue that you were thinking about your next book?
That was really inspired by my own personal experiences. So this was well before the summer of 2020, when people came out of the woodwork to support DEI. Had been in the work for a few years, and my daughter's school had a DEI program. And I joined the committee. You look around and it's like all white women. You're like, what the heck is going on here? This is so weird.
Now, you got to give us some context. So is the school in a community that's pretty diverse, or?
Very white dominated community. Yeah.
Okay, so that's not that odd then. When you
Yeah. Especially where are the men? Where is the,
Oh, okay, gotcha.
there is a pretty healthy Asian American population. It wasn't reflective. Yeah. Thanks, Oscar, for that. Like, it really wasn't reflective of the community. And I thought to myself, we have to include more people in this conversation. Like, what are we doing here? And to be honest, I was just disappointed by the lack of like genuine commitment, just kind of tiptoeing around the issues and unwillingness to talk about what the kids were already experiencing. And having seen my daughter experience microaggressions and be witness to microaggressions, I just thought we've got to have more tools to be a better ally. And that's what inspired the book, is my own personal journey, but also, again, comparing notes with experts and people doing the work to say, we need that recipe, we need that toolkit. I think what people really need too are activities. The thing that we struggle with, I think, in the DEI community, there's just a lot of talking at people, right? And we know people need to interact with the content. They need to interact with the ideas. They need to have their own personal experiences for it to be real for them. So having some assessment tools, having some activities that you can do with your work team, your family, it's meant to be personal and professional. Just hard topics like privilege. People don't want to talk about that stuff, but when you do, you come out on the other side like a better person, a deeper understanding about other people. And so just making those barriers to the conversation less risky and it's done for you. So you can literally just follow again the directions.
Right. I love many things about your book, but when listeners read your book, they will see after each of the chapters, there are a lot of assessments and activities that you ask them to do, ask them to think about. And so it really kind of gives a roadmap for how they can make their environments more inclusive. Another thing I really love about your book is really how vulnerable you are in telling your own stories, both some shortcomings that you've had. I call them cultural faux pas. We all make them, but also some triumphs that you have. And I think that's very instructive for many readers of the book. One of the quotes that I wanted to highlight that you wrote is white guilt is real. So tell us about that and why it's important to interrogate white guilt in order to advance the EI.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really hard one for white people to admit is you stumble into these situations, and just because we are in a white supremacist culture, you don't even have to think about your whiteness. And when you get challenged about your whiteness or you have to think about your whiteness, it's very uncomfortable for white people. And of course, that's very silly because for people of color, that's a constant thing you have to experience, which is super unfortunate. But yeah, I think the times when I think the biggest thing I've noticed about whiteness is the ability to move freely. I can go into spaces and I can say things and I can do things, and I'm not going to have a lot of repercussions, even when I behave, hate to use the stereotype, but like a Karen. It's just then when I get called out on it or I realize it later, my behavior, you do feel guilty like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Ew, if I were a different skin color, identity, insert anything else, that wouldn't be okay. And I think that guilt is just, it's a struggle for white people. I think the guilt of our history is hard. And for a lot of white people, that excuse of, well, I wasn't the one that my ancestors weren't even involved in slavery. Well, we still all benefit from the intergenerational wealth, from the systems that were created that benefited white people over people of color. And I think that's hard to acknowledge. Like to acknowledge that you almost have to go from that apathetic state, almost denial, to a place of awareness. And then once you're in awareness, you kind of have to take action. And then there's that rub of like, well, what do I do about this? And that's still where we're at, Oscar. I think that awareness phase is still where we're at. It makes me sad doing the work that we do in education because I wish more people could get to that awareness phase so that they could take action in a meaningful way. But we still got to get our allies up to speed on things. And my daughter is learning about history right now, fourth grade. So pretty basic. But one of the things that was super disturbing in her history book was they talked about slavery in the terms of slaves being helpful. And I thought, I was appalled. We had a very serious conversation about it. But if we're still teaching that way, that's going to make the awareness piece harder for people. And we have a lot of work to do to educate people. And we don't need to tell false narratives to children to have to undo later.
So let me ask you, Julie, because education is key, but I do know that, and as you know, it doesn't just stop at education because people have to act as well. I use the example of myself. I clearly know I shouldn't eat some things because it's bad for my health, but I still eat it.
Right.
So, there's always this gap between education and action. And so I am really trying to move people from the education to the action part of it. And so I agree that some people may not know, but I don't think the lack of action is necessarily due to education. I think a lot of people know much more about history, about what's going on, about their own privilege than they actually say. And so I'm trying to assess, at least hear from you, what you think, what can actually get the people moved from just the awareness to the actual action part. And I guess the action part for me is, like you said, breaking down systems of advantage and disadvantage.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at, Oscar. I'm torn right now about new book ideas because I'm kind of sick of writing about individual actions, to be honest, because exactly what you just said. I think people do have the tools and know what to do. I mean, there's tons of DEI books out there. Like, if you can't figure it out, I don't know what to tell you. There's tons of good books. But the systems piece, an individual can only do so much. The systems have to change. And that's really complicated work on purpose. Right? The systems were designed by a certain type of person for a certain type of person to succeed, not people like us. And that's the part that I think corporate America will have to lead that. It's going to be harder to do politically, especially with like state by state legislation right now. It's just really rough. Everything's pointing to people trust corporations to lead social change more so than expect their politicians to. So, what does that mean? Well, it means if you're a corporate leader, or really anybody in corporate, HR professional, anyone, look at how you hire, where you recruit from, really take a deep dive on bias and how your job descriptions are written and whether college degrees are really needed and how do you promote people? How do you manage performance? Is there objective criteria and a career succession track that's clearly defined so we just don't continue to perpetuate the same people getting those positions? Because we know diversity matters and there's a 39% higher likelihood of financial success when you have a diverse leadership team. And diversity is just a fact. I mean, the workforce will be majority non-white here in a few years, 20% LGBTQ plus, 20% neurodiversity. Like there's just so much diversity coming to the workforce that we're going to have to pay attention to, and it's going to make us better. But we need to adjust our systems to be ready to really leverage the scale of diverse talent.
I like that explanation and leads to the topic of this conversation of allyship, because we know many people, I don't think there's any shortage of people who call themselves allies. And we know, in your book, the dictionary.com named it the 2021 word of the year. And so certainly after the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery murders in 2020, it seemed like everyone wanted to be an ally. But what I find fascinating in this moment right now, I think, is the whiplash of everyone coming out to be allies in 2020, but 2024, now we see so many people backtracking. Even when it comes to the Supreme Court case that ruled affirmative action, basically dismantled affirmative action in a higher ed setting, I have seen organizations even go beyond that to try to change and gut DEI. And so in my TEDx talk, I call it performative activism and allyship. I'm curious as to what your thoughts of where we are today when we see this 2020 wave of allyship and then this retreat that's going on right now that in many cases, I think it's unprecedented.
Yeah, I know. I remember the summer of 2020, literally, it's just such a weird year for everybody. But I'm having full speaking engagement lineup, did my TED talk, all that stuff. And then March happens, everything goes away. It was just like that. Diversity doesn't matter, Julie. Like, I can't focus on that right now. And then suddenly, late May, that changed again. And I was so suspect. His corporate leader, I mean, my phone was blowing up, email box.
Likewise.
I was like, what is happening? Because for those of us who have been in the work, and you're like, this kind of stuff happens a lot, sadly. It's terrible. But you kind of become numb to it. And I was like, do they really care this time? It was just, and I remember a lot of my Black friends and colleagues were like, just wait, it'll go back. And I was like, no, people really care this time, and here we are, which makes me very sad. There's a lot of the DEI work. I think the biggest challenge is that people don't understand what it is. Like when people throw around things like DEI must die and diversity higher and just these like false narratives, I try to come at it at a place of like little facetiously like curious with people. If I overhear a comment or, somebody saying like, oh, these diverse hires is just terrible or whatever they're saying, it's just like, oh, well, what does that mean? Oh, I'm so curious. Like, what does DEI mean to you? And Oscar, usually people don't have a great answer. And they almost always backpedal into, oh, that does matter. Like, oh, yeah, you can kind of catch people teaching themselves through that exercise. Now, I'll be honest, if someone consumes media, a certain channel or two that's out there that has a lot of false information, it is harder to have that conversation. But for most people, I genuinely believe that we're somewhere in the middle where they just don't understand it yet. They don't understand the value of the work. They don't understand what's in it for them. They don't understand why it matters to someone that's different from them. The biggest gap I think we're still at today and I don't know how to solve this one, is just lived experience gap. If, say, if we were white men that had walked around and not had the microaggressions, the harassment, the belittling, the undermining, they just don't experience it at the same rate as other people. And it's almost like when you tell them the stories of what happens, you're like, what? That would never happen to me. I'm like, yeah, it would never happen to you, but it does. Just because it doesn't happen to you doesn't mean it doesn't happen to other people. And that lived experience gap is something we have to close. But when we live in a society that's still very segregated and very dominated by certain types of people, you don't get that exposure and awareness. And that's what has me really curious right now in this conversation. Like, I'm really more excited about talking to young people about this because they get it. Like, when you talk to young people about these issues, like, they don't even question, like, well, what am I supposed to do? Like adults do. Young people are like, oh, I'm going to do something about
Hmm.
it. You can see that with the, protests right now. I mean, but they need tools, they need information too. So it's going to be interesting. I do agree. We're in a reckoning right now. I just did a LinkedIn poll on should we keep the DEI acronym or not? It was kind of mixed. My concern is when there is anti DEI legislation that makes it literally illegal
Right.
to do this work, we might have to change the acronym. And I don't love that. No matter what we call it, the work doesn't change. But I think we do need to be mindful about the language that we use so that we can get as many people into this conversation as possible.
That's an interesting concept. Obviously, I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are in states, professors in states where DEI has quote unquote been ruled unconstitutional, illegal, however you want to put it. I don't know if changing the language is the right way to go. I mean, they're literally words and words have meanings, right? And so diversity, equity, inclusion have been a part of our vocabulary for
Right.
hundreds of years or whatever. And so I agree. I think the work still needs to happen, but I don't know the effectiveness if we call something different.
If we keep having to rebrand,
Right. It kind of like loses, I think we just lose language at that point when it comes to something like that. It's not a slur, right? It's not like we're trying to get rid of a slur or epithet or something like that. These are just normal words.
I know it's funny because there seems to be a problem with acronyms, CRT, SEL. People just weaponize them. And this is the big debate right now in our space is do we just call it inclusion? Do we just call it belonging? Like for me, doing allyship work has always been central to this narrative because of my limited lived experiences. I want to teach people how to be better allies for people. So that word to me feels really good and strong going forward. But I, like you, I worry that watering it down or rebranding and pivoting loses the impact of the work that's been going on for a while. I don't know where we net out on this. I honestly don't. I wish I had a better answer,
Yeah. No.
honestly.
No. I mean, we all are grappling with this. And that's the thing, like many of us don't have answers yet. But I know we will get there. And it's like conversations like this is help us get us closer to those answers. I think you always are really gracious in your work. And even in this conversation, I think you've been really gracious with how you discuss these issues. One of the points that you make in the book as well that I think is important about this conversation, in addition to not having the lived experiences, is also this allegiance to this myth of meritocracy that you also go deep in the book. So can you help our listeners unpack that concept?
The myth of meritocracy is kind of like, have you ever heard someone say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or I worked hard to get to where I am, or my life has been so difficult, ABC happened. This is I think, another big challenge that we have, especially in American society, where we really reverend, kind of that underestimated mindset. Like we can all come from nothing to get to this successful place. And that might be true for people. And certainly there's a lot of great examples of people that have come from really marginalized beginnings to achieve great things. But we know the chances of success are much higher for people in the dominant group. And so if you have a disability, pulling yourself by your bootstraps, is that really gonna make sense? Of course, women, trans folks, people of color, it's just there are more things holding you back on that journey to get there that no one's going to tell you, right? Like the world's going to, it's going to be harder for you, but you're going to feel it. What happens is, at least from my, again, limited experience, is you feel like it's you. You feel like you're the one that's wrong when you're experiencing the hardship or, people making comments. Like, I just remember I was always a great student and just people were like, "Oh, are you going to go to college?" It's like, yeah. And I just don't think that same comment would happen if I were more affluent and I were a man. Similar in corporate America, it was like, wow, Julie is like amazing at whatever it was that was like a very small task. And you just feel like, is that all they expect from me? Like, wow, the bar is really low. And we do that. We do that. We other people, that myth of meritocracy that we're all treated the same is just not the reality. That's the goal, though, right? The E, back to the DEI acronym, that's what the E is all about, is equity, equitable treatment, giving people the resources and tools they need, not treating everybody equally. But if we treat people equitably, we get more equality on the back end. And it's a tough road for people. Again, they need the awareness, they need the exposure, they need tools, they need information. It's just this gap that people have based on their own limited understanding. Like the way I try to teach privilege is I call it the P word because it's another word that just, I've literally had like people like slam their laptops, just throw a fit when I mention the word. And instead of thinking of it as a bad thing, think of it as a good thing. It's a way to be helpful. If I have privilege, wow, how can I leverage that to help other people? How can I use that as a tool to be a better ally? And that's when we start to see traction because it feels really good to give. Like, simple example, yesterday I was shopping and I had a full basket of groceries, right? And the man in front of me, who happened to be a Black man, had two things. I was like, go ahead of me. Just like he was standing beside me. And I said, go ahead. It's a simple example of being like, I have a bunch of stuff. He doesn't need to wait. He has two things. And he said, thank you so many times. And I just thought, wow, like it felt good to be helpful. It felt good to see somebody and be able to make a small difference in their day. And I think if more people just look for those opportunities to demonstrate allyship, simple example, that's obviously I could do way more than that, but those little interventions make such a big impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. And tell me if you agree with this, and it's okay if you don't. But I think part of the myth and what really fuels the myth of meritocracy a lot is also this notion that DEI is a zero-sum game, right? If I give you something, then I'm going to lose something. And so what are your thoughts about that?
Oh, the zero sum game is such a harmful mentality. And we can see how this plays out in world events. I mean, if you look at the wars going on right now, it's I win, you lose. It's like, it just rarely works like that. What we know is that when we share resources, we all benefit. It isn't an I lose, you win. And the example I use, and we have tons of data on this around diversity, is when we have diverse leadership teams, right? Chances of success, profitability, revenue rates, innovation rates, ideas, there's just so much data to support. It isn't my seat versus your seat at the leadership table. It's not we promote women over men or people of color over white people. It's just when we have more diversity at the table, we have more seats at the table. Like, that's just how it works. It's not a pie slice versus a pie slice. It's the pie gets bigger. But when we have this mentality, and I think this is a big problem right now, while we're hiring more diverse talent, people hear that message and they're like, oh, well, I'm a white man. I'm never going to get hired. And it's like, what? what are you talking about? Like, that is not what's actually happening in B. Like, that's not how it's going to work. We have, again, back to flawed systems that tend to benefit certain types of people over others. And it's so not even visible, right? Like these biased statements. One of the biggest biases is the potential versus performance bias, where we know people of the dominant group, we judge them by potential. Well, I've seen a bunch of people that look like them perform really well, so therefore they must. It's that halo effect. People that don't fit that same profile. You think about somebody with autism, 85% of autistic people are unemployed. And a lot of it has to do with the social skills and interviewing. Great, could do the job wonderfully, but don't make eye contact, don't shake your hand, don't follow the social norms, and they're not going to be hired. And it's like, what we all lose when we have these rigged systems that don't work for people. And just because of the sheer force of the pipeline of talent that's coming into the workforce, these things will have to change. They're going to have to change. Luckily, I'm working with organizations that see it. They're coming and they know the runway is limited. But there's a lot of organizations out there that are like, we're fine. We don't have a problem here. We're good. Like, oh, you just wait. And I don't want any ill will on anyone, but I'm kind of like, it's going to happen. And you're going to have to address it. So why not be proactive versus having to be reactive later?
Speaking of being a proactive leader, right? I think one of the ways that people can become more proactive if misperceptions are cleared up. And so you've been doing this work for a very long time. What are some of the common misperceptions that people have of allyship?
I mean, I think you said earlier, like people call themselves allies. I don't think that's how it works. Like I would never say I'm an ally. It just feels disingenuous. It's when someone says, Julie, you've been an ally for me, that I feel like I'm recognized. So it's very much in the eye of the beholder. I think people think it's a badge of honor, a self-proclamation, and it just doesn't work that way. It's almost like to be an ally is to not want to be recognized as, you're doing it for the right reasons, not for your own ego. It's not a saviorism. It's not I come in, Oscar, I've got this for you. Let me show you how great I am, and I'm going to clean up this mess for you. Like, that's really belittling to somebody, and it's not sustainable. An ally is almost somebody that's not even, they're in the corner rooting for you, watching things, removing obstacles, and not looking for the credit for it. They're just there because they care and they want the world to be a better place and they believe in you. And when I get a chance to be an ally for somebody, I mean, it's such a great honor. It feels so, I can't even describe the feeling. Like it just feels amazing. But I do think allies need to be intentional and consistent. It's not a 2020 show up at a protest and then peace out. Like that's really unhelpful. And like, don't bother if that's the way you're going to show up. You need to be, it's like a drumbeat. Like you need to continuously be like just constantly working on this. One of the examples I use, like for my Forbes column, when I had the privilege of getting to publish, I thought about how I wanted to use the platform. And a woman of color that I'm friends with that we host a podcast together had made the intro for me to do it, which is kind of like how rare is that she paved the way for me, which was just so, again, an honor. That was really cool. And so because Simone had trusted me with that and made that help me with that, I thought I'm going to leverage this platform primarily to showcase women of color stories as an ally and interview women of color. And so I very seldom interview, and I'm not being discriminatory, of course, if someone has a great story. I definitely have interviewed several white men, so please don't hear it this way. But my priority is to amplify the voices and the stories of women of color because sadly, there's just so many fewer stories published with their perspective. And so I think we can all like really dial in on how we want to show up and carve out that space, whether that's personally, professionally, who you mentor, who you sponsor, who you spend time with. All of those choices, if you just get a little more intentional with it, you can be a better ally.
Shout out to Simone, your co-host of the Inclusion School podcast. It's a wonderful story. So glad you shared that, Julie. And so before we leave, as a consultant, I get a lot of questions. And so people ask me for my advice. And I want to ask you, what advice do you have for people who are looking to get into this space? Whether it's speaking, whether it's podcast hosting, whether it's the consulting. Just curious, what's some advice that you give them?
Really dial in on like, what is the work? Like, this is something I'm struggling with right now, right? Like, it's a fraught space, a lot of hard conversations. I think if you want to get into DEI work or do more DEI work, what gives you purpose? Like, what, I mean, think about like your very best days. Like, what's your flow state like? Like, is it writing? Is it ideas? Is it meeting with people, speaking, whatever it is? Like, really dial in on your flow state and what gives you that energy, because this is taxing work. Like, this is really, it's just, there is such a ebb and flow, a roller coaster ride that we're on with the work. And for me, if I can really focus on the things that I really enjoy doing, for me, it's speaking, it's writing, it's managing my business. And that helps me weather the storms that are inevitably going to come when I get really ticked off about something in the news cycle. Oh my gosh, Oscar, someone a couple weeks ago said DEI means didn't earn it.
Oh, yeah.
Like, dear Lord, like, I want to scream. Like, I get so upset. Like, you have no idea what you're talking about, right? It's like, all that to say, this work is tough and people say things that are really irritating. So you really have to be like, here's how I'm going to use my voice. Here's how I'm going to use my energy. Because if you try to do all the things, you'll burn out. I've seen so many people burn out, compassion fatigue, just exhaustion, mental health issues. It's very real in our space. So for me, I took that as a chance to write an article. I got really fired up and got really excited. And I was like, here's how I'm going to channel that energy. But I think for everyday people, you can find a way to channel that energy in a way that hits your energy state, like dials into your purpose. So having those relief valves is really helpful.
And let me clear up another misconception that's out there a lot that people have about, quote unquote, how much money is spent in the DEI business. Let's keep things in perspective. It is relatively little money that's spent on DEI. I have a PhD in management. I'm a business school professor. Let me tell you, organizations will pay me 2 or 3 times more money to talk about a topic like leadership than they would DEI. So journalists, scholars, researchers, everyone out there, please stop pushing this myth that people are getting paid so much money in the DEI space and people are in it just for money, because you're using an aggregate total of every action that occurs from every DEI consultant or business, and you're not putting it in perspective. Like I said, organizations will pay me 2 or 3 times more if I just talked about a general leadership topic than if they called me in for a DEI topic. And so if you were looking at the...
Totally. No, thank you for saying that. Because most DEI people, I mean, if you look at their salaries at organizations too, they're not even on the C-suite like you would for regular, like a position that was important. They're usually, most organizations, they're not even paid extra. They're doing the work in addition to their day job. It's voluntary. And so I agree. The aggregate total is really unhelpful.
It's so disingenuous. So like, oh, it's $1 billion industry. Well, guess what? Any type of training is $1 billion industry if you use an aggregate total.
Exactly.
People, you like pay people to come in and talk about, the Myers-Briggs assessment or something like that. So please, that's like you're doing a service when you talk about DEI professionals in that way.
And I appreciate you saying that, because the first thing I studied was business. I have an MBA. And so for me, it's like, I've questioned this work sometimes because it doesn't feel, honestly, like the business model. Like, this isn't a very profitable area. Like, this is something that's tied to politics and the news cycle and social issues. Like, if you're a business person, that's not very attractive. And I would say the other misconception is people say DEI training doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work, because the most common training is unconscious bias done once a year. That does not work, because guess what? I'm going to wave a magic wand and fix people with the 1 hour conscious bias training.
Exactly. Thank you so much for bringing up, because that's, again, I really, really want to clear up these misconceptions. I would shout out to one of my great mentors and friends, Quinetta Robinson, Ozias Moore. I know they recently published a paper in AMR giving people a theoretical conceptual framework of how DEI training can be more effective. But you're absolutely right. I don't know why people think doing something for 1 hour on a conscious bias, like the training itself is not, like if I were to teach a person how to be a CPA in 1 hour, we'd be like, oh no, accounting training is ineffective. Like, no, it's just not enough time.
Right.
You need more time to train
Silly.
people. And so thank you for saying that. Please stop saying DEI training is ineffective. Well, yeah, you can get some bad trainers for sure, just like they could be bad trainers in any subject area. But it in of itself is not the issue. It's the investment and the time that people actually spend on it. That's the issue.
No, it has to be like 3 things: intentional, consistent, not just once, and senior leadership. If
Right.
senior leadership's not there or bought into it, like it's not going to work.
So I would love to continue to talk to you, but we do have to come to a close. I just want to give you the opportunity to shout out some of the projects or initiatives that may be coming in the future that we can look out for.
Oh, thanks for that. Probably the thing that I'm most excited right now is in August, there's an International Allyship Day. So this will be our first year that we're doing an event in New York City to celebrate it. And so we have some really great keynotes and corporation DEI leaders that are going to speak at it. And I think where we're at right now, what I'm most excited about is building intentional allyship programs inside organizations. I really think that's how we change the future, is again through corporate and leadership and building these programs that teach people how to be better. And we've seen some really tremendous results: better retention rates, promotion rates of historically marginalized groups. When you have allies, people empower, mentoring, sponsoring, spending time, talent, and developing them. And so that's something I'm really excited about. I'd say to Allyship in Action, you mentioned the book. It's still, I'm still noodling on the next book idea, but that book still to me is my favorite book I got to write, because it really does guide people through the process of being a better ally. And so I think it's a great book to read. I tried to make it a book club read, or like something you could read with your work team and do the assessments and activities together. There's a workbook that has a whole bunch of activities for team building. So your next team building adventure, pull out one of those activities and give it a whirl. It's all done for you. I think the future of inclusion is these meet people where they at, like those keep the drumbeat going, these micro activities, these doses. It's not a whack-a-mole, hit people over the head with like racism. And it's like, oh, there's small doses of like, I hadn't thought about it that way. Like that's when I think we start to change minds. It's not an overnight thing. It's just small doses over time. So thank you for your support on that.
No, thank you so much, Julie, for joining me in the guest chair today. You're giving us so much to think about with respect to allyship, but also many tools that we can actually become better allies. So I encourage all my listeners to pick up all 6 of your books, especially Allyship in Action, which we discussed today, and continue to learn by checking out her podcast, The Inclusion School. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Diversity Matters. If you enjoyed our show and want to hear more, please subscribe to our show, post, talk about, and reshare our show with all of your friends and family. And leave us a favorable review and rating so that will make it easier for others to find us wherever they listen to podcasts. We cannot do this important work or keep it going without you, so we really appreciate your support. We especially like to thank our episode sponsor, CO Power LLC, and the studio at Kearney Point. The studio at Kearney Point is a state-of-the-art facility to handle all of your recording and production needs. For more information, please visit their website at www.kearneypoint.studio. If you or your company would like to sponsor a Diversity Matters episode, please visit the podcast section of our website at www.whconsultingfirm.com for more information. Diversity Matters is produced by WH Consulting, a firm that provides a wide range of management and consulting and professional services to individuals and organizations. Original music produced by Sincere Morton Murray. Until next time, peace and love.